Okay, so based on the first round of feedback I got, I had a very boring title, so I tried to jazz it up a little bit and refer to what I'm talking about as the fraud of the century, which is a quote of one of the socios of Boca who never saw this project culminated. So I have Boca Juniors as fraud of the century, soccer consumption and urban transformation in post-war Buenos Aires. So, in the early 1960s, one of Buenos Aires' most popular soccer clubs, Club Atlético Boca Juniors, undertook a massive urban project they called the Ciudad Deportiva, or the Sports City. The club planned the Ciudad Deportiva as a mix between a new stadium, a sports complex, recreational facilities, and somewhat of an amusement park. It was to be built on 7 artificial islands spanning 40 hectares off the coast in the Rio de la Plata. And for those of you who have been to Buenos Aires or know it very well, you have here the Plaza de Mayo, the kind of spiritual and physical center of the city in some ways, and then here this red block. This is an aerial photograph of 1965 Buenos Aires. This is where the Ciudad Deportiva was planned to be built. So I want to point this out just to give you a sense that this is in the heart of Buenos Aires. And also another curiosity is that this is what's now Puerto Madero, which is one of the most expensive, exclusive neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. And here you have Boca. And so proximity to Boca, the actual heart of the club itself, but also very close to the center of the city, and this is the river that it was being built into. So they planned 7 artificial islands to be built in this red space, which is roughly 40 hectares. So the club successfully lobbied the National Congress to pass legislation donating the river property to Boca, since this river was federal property. And they also passed laws to provide tax exemptions for construction materials, a law that actually continues to this day, providing tax-free purchases to clubs that are going to build their infrastructure. It's called the Ley de Boca after that. Boca Juniors was and remains one of the most popular professional teams in the whole of Argentina, and they counted on that national base of support to conduct a marketing campaign to finance the project, and they sold over 140,000 títulos pro patrimoniales to members, fans, and the general public. And just to give you an idea, these títulos were essentially kind of booster raffle tickets that gave the purchasers certain rights to the facilities once it was built. So you'd get discounts at the cafe, discounts on season tickets, things like this, and also the right to participate in a series of monthly, annual, quadrennial raffles to win things from a weekend theater ticket to a new department or a racehorse. So some fantastic prizes being offered by Boca Juniors. Now by 1968, the ambitious plan had advanced considerably, and porteños flocked to the waterfront on weekends to watch construction. They actually did. This was kind of like a weekend thing to do, to go down to the Costanera Sur and see what was going on with the Ciudad Deportiva. The facilities would include a drive-in movie theater, a fish-shaped aquarium, 18 tennis courts, soccer and rugby fields, and a small amusement park. I have some really nice images of the Ciudad Deportiva from postcards here. So this is the main restaurant and cafe that was being built as kind of the entrance point to the Ciudad Deportiva. Here you have a concert pavilion, which is called the Pabellón de las Américas, and you had all the flags flying of all the nations in the Americas. This is another view. So we were here, and now we're looking south. Boca's here in the upper right. We're looking south down the Costanera Sur, the Avenida España, and here you have 2 of the bridges that would be connecting, and the fountain Arco Iris. And so here's the kind of best color photo of the most advanced stage of the Ciudad Deportiva that I've found. You have over in the far right the restaurant and cafe in the Fuerte Arco Iris, and then you have the Pabellón de las Américas. It's an Olympic swimming pool. Here's the 18 tennis courts. This was a saltwater pool in the shape of a K. And then here you have Argentina's first and largest drive-in movie theater. You have the screen there. And then a nighttime view of the Fuente Arco Iris. It's all of its splendor. And then a daytime view of pretty much the same perspective. So, all this, you see some of its most advanced state of the construction of the Ciudad Deportiva. But by 1973, the project was in crisis. And the most important element, which was to be Boca's new stadium, which was supposed to be higher capacity than the Maracanã, it never grew beyond its foundations. Now, the club was able to raise additional funds and promised to have the stadium finally completed by 11 a.m. on May 25th of 1975. But despite these fresh resources, construction remained halted. And when the deadline passed, it was clear that Ciudad Deportiva was never going to be ready for the 1978 World Cup final. Right? So the 1978 World Cup final was supposed to be played in this stadium. Instead, as we all know, it was played in River Stadium, and Argentina won. So, what had been this sort of harbinger of national progress and modernization had become, quote, the fraud of the century. And after nearly 2 decades of neglect, after 1978, the club sold the entire property in 1992, and today the vacant lot sits right off the coast, isolated, right next to a shanty town named after Rodrigo Bueno, actually. And it borders Buenos Aires' most expensive and exclusive neighborhood. So you have this abandoned lot that they've sometimes had Pepsi concerts at. So Shakira and Green Day have been playing at the Ciudad Deportiva. Now, what I want to argue with the story of the Ciudad Deportiva is that it helps reveal the intertwining of politics and consumption in post-war Buenos Aires. The project was profoundly shaped by the idea that consumption was an integral component of citizenship and national progress, a trend that began in the early 20th century, but was typified by Peronism's articulation of social justice. The federal government and the city municipal government, both lent support to the Ciudad Deportiva by providing direct subsidies and integrating the project into the city's master plan. The city's master plan viewed the Costanera Sur as kind of this redevelopment zone that never could be, till Puerto Madero. And they talked about that entire space being transformed into like a third large green space of the city that would be right accessible from downtown. The general public invested an impressive amount of money and faith into the undertaking. So by economic, political, and cultural registers, both the government's support, the amount of money raised, and the significance of the actual site, this was a truly monumental undertaking. And so I analyze and explain this massive effort in 2 ways. First, I place the Ciudad Deportiva into its historical context as part of attempts to modernize the city in a post-Peronist Buenos Aires. And second, I examine the novel acts of consumption and leisure available at the Ciudad Deportiva and why porteños were drawn to these particular activities, novelties like a drive-in movie theater, alongside traditional things like tennis courts that clubs had always offered as part of their offerings. The initial success of the project reveals that porteños and public officials clearly bought into the idea that a soccer club, civic association, could provide the city with a massive leisure site that contributed to its modernization. However, the project's equally monumental failure illuminates the broader political and economic changes that contributed to the project's demise and that were felt by Argentines as a whole during the 1960s and 70s. And so that's kind of the broad arc for those who didn't read the paper. And just very briefly, the burning question of what happened, and which I get into in the paper a little bit, but sort of in the most free-flowing way that I can explain now. Basically, what I see happened is that the club president, Alberto J. Armando, who's the 10th richest man in Argentina at a certain point, he mixed all of his accounts. So his auto sales empire, his financing empire, Boca's presence as one of the national powers in soccer, and the Ciudad Deportiva, all those accounts I think he kind of managed together. And so when things weren't going particularly well on one front or the other, I think he was siphoning funds from one. And so on top of this, the financial situation of Argentina in the early 1970s, right when it was crucially necessary to have those funds available to build the stadium, I think fell through. And so there was also very dishonest treatment of the título holders themselves. They were cheated off of like raffles. People didn't get their prizes. This got them sued a couple times, and people actually won their suits. And I also think that the stadium construction itself may have never actually been feasible. They ignored a couple of engineering reports that said, like, no, dummies, you're building on a river and the weight can't support, the erosion is always going to. They said, no. They just listened to the reports that they wanted to. And so I also wanted to share with you all that I'm now almost to a halfway point in my fieldwork. And so I see this as a very, I'm very interested to hear everyone's thoughts and take this opportunity to genuinely thank Chris and Jeff and everyone that's been involved in the organization and reading and our anonymous readers for their efforts. I think this is really a unique opportunity that a lot of us don't get as academics, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback. So with some specifics on that, I'd really like to see what you think of the themes that I'm trying to develop alongside this narrative. I think I have a very interesting story, but I think my so what links are underdeveloped, and I really invite you to be as critical and aggressive about that as possible. Given that I can now orient the rest of my fieldwork towards that feedback, I mean, I can take this and develop it into like a new archival research plan. So be as fantastical and creative as you want and say, no, you should look at this, or I have an archive, wherever. Feel free to toss that kind of thing in. I'm also curious to know, on the one hand, what parts of the story itself you find most compelling and interesting from like a dramatic standpoint. I think I have richness in this story that I really want to harp on. And also, on the other hand, what you find the most convincing angles of analysis that I've established in the paper so far that will actually contribute to historiography. I have my sentiments on where that's going, but I'd like to hear y'all's. So feel free to grill me as much as you like and ask broad questions. And thank you.
Alex, you had this fascinating sort of idea of public consumption. It almost reminded me of like the aesthetic sensibility of the French modern period and the idea of the flaneur, and being very visibly urban and visibly modern and participating in all these kind of cultural attractions and almost as a social performance, right? Which I just found incredibly interesting. And as to the third theme of haunting and ghosts, Alex, when I read your paper, I was reminded of Michael Moore's movie Roger and Me. I don't know if anyone else has seen that movie, but it's about the Flint, Michigan, the car plants, and how they built this great big mall to attract people to Michigan in the heart of America, and Fordism and auto production, and come and see this mall, which is this tremendous patriotic display, and then all of a sudden, the auto industry crashes, and you have this kind of terrifying ghost of a mall haunting Flint, Michigan, and this terrible poverty that's kind of come afterwards. And so I was quite taken by this idea of the Ciudad Deportiva haunting the public spirit of Argentina, of sort of this idea of the promise of kind of modernity and everything's kind of getting better, and then all of a sudden you throw a wrench into it. And it was particularly interesting. You have this line in the paper, for those of you who didn't read it, that George Soros is actually one of the prospective developers of this vacant lot. And that is depending on the fact that the shanty towns that are there are demolished. So I mean, there's so many interesting things going on in that little slice of information. Argentina and Buenos Aires are talked about in terms of ghosts of the disappeared and all this kind of stuff. It's a very popular discourse in talking about that city. But this is another sort of ghost of progress or of modernity in a very particular form that I think is there haunting the space. Alex, first of all, with your discussion of Buenos Aires and the Ciudad Deportiva, so there's a bunch of scholars of Argentina in this room, and perhaps this is something that you guys chew on a lot, so forgive me if this is a common theme, but how can we understand this example of modernity and public consumption in Buenos Aires? Is that a metonym for all of Argentina, or how does this process of public modernity and consumption kind of reproduce or heighten or lessen kind of social inequalities elsewhere in the country? What is the reaction sort of outside of Buenos Aires and other cities in the provinces to this? Is this something that people are sort of chuckling about, saying, oh, they had it coming, or is this sort of contributing to a general, I don't know, what are some other reactions to this? The second question is kind of a funny one too, but I was wondering, I know you play soccer, and I know you're going to humor me as someone who's interested in anthropology, but I was interested in actually how your bodily practice as a soccer player kind of comes in contact with your studies of soccer. Did this get talked about yesterday or something? You guys
should have.
Okay. So, I mean, this is something that, I think goes through a lot of us who are mixing kind of archival and contemporary research, is that when we insert ourselves into this research, I mean, how does that change the process? So you play soccer. How does that affect your studies of soccer and soccer players and identity?
Super questions. The first one is Yeah, I think the hunch that you have that you're tapping into is correct. The story of the Ciudad Deportiva is one that I obviously think is speaking to wider political and economic changes. And the core question is, what is available for Argentines to consume, and what does that mean? What does it mean to be able to go to a drive-in movie theater? I think is something that hangs over the Ciudad Deportiva a lot. The way I tease that out in the actual research is depending from activity to activity. So something like the athletic, the swimming pools, tennis courts, things that you could do at a lot of other clubs in Argentina is something that I see as a deep continuity as to what public leisure space and the sort of semi-public private leisure space that clubs inhabit in kind of like a weird zone. What that means at different points in Argentina's history. The more novel stuff is something that I'm really tapping into both Natalia Milanesia's work and Eduardo Elena's work, and Matthew Crush's to a little bit as well, to also try and not assign too much novelty to that. There's a very real way in that the most fantastical elements of the Ciudad Deportiva, like a giant tower with a rotating restaurant and the movie theater, those are just kind of the flavors of the week of just very very spectacular markers of a certain level of consumption that can be purveyed to a certain section of the country through kind of the experience of Buenos Aires being kind of shopped around to the rest of the country. That is really interesting for me. Yeah, and that's what I'm here to really listen to everyone else about and see what their ideas are and what the most useful way to go about talking about that more is. The bodily practice as a player, I started staring at Rouhani because Rouhani and I have played together in Buenos Aires. And yeah, in a nutshell, I think the third night that I was in Buenos Aires on my first pre-dissertation trip, I was playing soccer with at least 3 people that have been crucial in the development of my research. Brenda was talking about how it was really difficult for her to get interviews done, and nobody would respond to her surveys. And I feel I've had a lot more success in that, not only through being able to relate as a player and as a fan, and as a guy, but also in that the contacts I've made through soccer have been snowball. That's been the snowball method for me.
Can I interrupt for a second? Do we hear enough of these voices in your research?
No, not nearly enough. They're slated. I'm just waiting to see what I want to ask them. I've done 12 interviews, and they make their way sometimes unsighted into the research on how the lens of analysis I'm bringing.
Unlike Jeffrey, you can conduct interviews.
Exactly.
In such a fascinating project, I thought more about the Viedma project a few years later, the ambitious project to establish a new Argentine capital in Patagonia. I don't hear the fans. There's some expressions of opposition here and there, but basically it's the vision. And we hear, obviously, you read main quotes from Armando. But where's the tension and the discussions and the disputes and the heated conflicts?
Yeah, it's tough to get to, even through their oral histories. So one of the most interesting interviews that I did to try and really get at this drama and the conflicts was with one of Armando's ex-vice presidents, Jesus Yaciain, and he was very dodgy. He was very dodgy about talking about figures, the exact things that were going on, why things went a certain way. I also spoke to one of the vocales of the club who had been around while Armando was there, and people who worked on the project itself. And the interviews, sometimes I've talked to them a couple times, they've always tended to go back to kind of like a somewhat tired narrative about the Ciudad Deportiva being kind of the national economy's fault, basically, or that Armando did what he could. They're fairly loyal to Armando, still, these people. But a lot of the people, unfortunately, that were heading up the opposition aren't around anymore. And the club documents themselves also are an official voice that don't capture that, since Armando was never kind of shifted out of power. And he actually passed away shortly after leaving the club, about 6 years after. But yeah, it's something that I need to dig into more with the oral histories.
Sorry for...
No problem. I'm sorry, I hope I answered the question there.
Ingrid, and then we'll go to Tim. Okay, so Stephanie.
I had a question for you, Alex, and I think this gets back to Sydney's question about the degree to which Buenos Aires can be sort of seen as a metonym of Argentina. And I wondered how, and I'm sure you talk about this in greater length, or you have some working concepts of it for your general project, but I wondered how national politics, what was going on the national stage versus local Buenos Aires city governance, how those came into contact in this process of constructing the Ciudad Deportiva.
Sure. In a very practical way, the executive power of the country and the Congress both intervened at very crucial stages with the Ciudad Deportiva. So, like I said, first in donating land, there was a very prominent national congressman, Reinaldo Elena, who had supported other clubs in acquiring land in Buenos Aires area and authorizing them to build on it. He was kind of leading the charge in the Ciudad Deportiva, getting its land. And it's also interesting to dive into the legislative record has debates and has more of a discussion where I can get at what was kind of the implicit or explicit pact between a public power supporting, a private entity being a club, and why were they donating this land to them. And so you get some continuities with I'm sure that we're all familiar with sports and urban expansion about hygiene and morality and improving bodies and healthy citizens, but also very real references to what Buenos Aires needs. So those were debated and called out in some ways on a national stage in Congress when, say, other clubs, like the law that I mentioned that Boca got passed to subsidize the construction materials. It was originally just for Boca. And then other congressmen stepped up and said, like, hey, what about other clubs? Like, we're improving the nation as well. We should get access to the same kinds of subsidies. And they were successful in doing that.
We don't hear them here.
Okay.
The other congressmen who say that it's an unfair play because there are other clubs who also...
Right. So yeah, another thing to tack on. The president at certain points intervenes, both Lanús, being a Boca fan, pulls strings to get the stadium construction authorized because there was a municipal law that said they had to have the proper roadways accessing the Ciudad Deportiva before they could build the stadium. And so Lanús steps in and pushes that through and says you can start. He's also there ceremonially to push like the first button that puts the first pilot into the ground for the stadium. And then beyond kind of national politics, like I said in the beginning, Boca counted on a truly national body of supporters to buy títulos. I have statistics from the Brazilian firm that was contracted by Boca to sell títulos, and more than half of the people who bought títulos were not Boca socios or even Boca fans. I'm taking their word for them I'm taking their word for that. But it reflects a lot of the other news stories that I've seen about it, that this was truly people who might have supported other teams or didn't care about soccer at all and just wanted to use the fishing house that bought into this. He sold 1,500 títulos in New York to the Argentine Social Club in New York. Yeah, I'll stop my answer there.
Jeff to my left.
Comment for us and a question for Ingrid. I'm thinking a lot about modernity rather than consumption, what you talked about. And I know like consumption is in many ways the performance of modernity, and I think that's something you're highlighting here. But I was also thinking about there's a certain anxiety in Argentina by the late 1960s, a realization that that begins to pervade society. You see it in popular literature and film that I'm pretty sure we're not a first world country anymore. Like it's finally dawned on them. Like I thought that had been consolidated in the 30s, like, but there's this admission, especially on the left, during the 60s, that I'm pretty sure we're a third world country, excuse me. And there's consumption is really, really linked to this yearning for modernity, and those designs scream like someone that had mentioned Disney World earlier. Certain developments you see.
It's the first time Argentines are going to Disney World too at the same time.
During the same time.
As like a thing. Like if you're growing up and you don't go to Disney World.
Right.
And you're, yeah.
Right. I was wondering, it would be interesting to see you tie it not just to politics of the moment and economies, which shape the discourse to a degree, not just to politics and economics, but also to if you can draw in other sources of the period, which I think you would find in places like Elena and Milanesio, that will speak to this larger just anxiety is a mild word for it.
Yeah.
But we need to acquire modernity fast and perform it and do something very, very quickly.
First, with Alex, I think that perhaps you're overly enamored of the story. And that's not because I'm against narrative. I'm very much in favor of narrative. I think stories are awesome. But I think you might want to think how to get out of it. And I have two ideas, since you asked for fantastical advice. And so these both might be fantastic.
Okay.
The one is to kind of think about the aesthetics of decay. And one place you might find it, I don't know if you'll find it, but I wonder if this space becomes a trope in, for example, films. And that this is what you show in a kind of grainy black and white when you want to make a commentary on something like that. So that was one idea I had. Very good look. And the other was, and this goes on with the not other Jeff, which had to do with modernity. And this is a real Brazilianist thing, but when you go from Sao Paulo to Buenos Aires, you realize how unmodern Buenos Aires is. I don't mean like in a technical sense, like in a sense of what modernism means and feels and everything. And I wondered if maybe if you thought in that context, in other words, don't think of it as modernity, but as something else, maybe that helps you interpret it in a really different kind of way. So those were two ideas that I thought about. And then the third is just a comment, which is, Cindy mentioned, the department mall, the mall in whatever. But my guess is every city, there are many cities throughout the world are filled with these kinds of monuments to extravagance / disaster. And it might be thinking about that in a way, not as part of the way cities work, as opposed to part of the way this city works. So that's just one idea.
Tack onto something you said for Alex, which I think when we talked about modernity, I think actually modernity is something that doesn't have a constant definition anywhere.
Sure.
But maybe what you might want to look into is what factors were going into the particular Argentine constitution of the modern imaginary when it was constructed. Because everywhere you go, you're going to have a different idea of what modern means. In Brazil, it could have this sort of industrial feeling. Somewhere else, it could have, but everyone sort of has their aesthetics of what modernity is. And so what you might be able to do is sort of trace into who was around, what stuff was going on when that particular Argentine imaginary of modernity was being constructed. Because modernity is not a fixed thing, and so that might be a way to...
No, the two people that I'm finding most useful to draw on with how they use modernity are. Elena describes both the maelstrom of modernity, but he also, in another part of his book, talks about overlapping trends of modernity being industrialization, urban expansion, wage labor, things like this, that I think let me have a very keen sense of what's going on in sort of the main economic and political trends that are driving a lot of the physical changes of the city. And James Ferguson's Expectations of Modernity, his book, has really been really helpful to just have a very clear orientation that there's ways people behave because they have a certain vision of where things are supposed to be going. And this is why I try and look at this as a 20th century story, because the expectations that people have about what a fantastical space Boca is going to build have their roots in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. And then this is why I engaged with Chris earlier about how he's thinking about modernity in a time that's decades and decades before mine. It's going to be work though to get even sharper and more useful for me. Jeff, I think you're echoing some of the historiography in Podolsky's book of the Specular City, and she gives me a great jumping base to just dig right into what she's already shown us. It's a path I want to go down. I think you're right on.
I have a methodological question of the first paper that is similar to the one that I made in regard to Juan's paper. So you talk about novel acts of consumption. You invoke Elena, you invoke Milanesio, as well as others. So you are talking about parentism and consumption. So you lead us down that path. And I think that there's more that you should think of. One of the things that came to mind was Campanella's film, and those who enjoyed it, and there were very many of us then, who saw that nostalgic look at the club as kind of a Peronist nostalgic look back. And you could look at what's going on with Boca here as a kind of nightmare explosion of what Peronismo meant. Now, maybe I've got that wrong, but whether it's that or whether there's something here about long-standing contradictions in the political ideal, the ideology, and the corruption of process. So the 1951 championship where the Peronist elites backed Racing Club against Banfield and so on. Whatever it is, I think that could be teased out to good advantage. I also would piggyback onto what Hyman said about sources to suggest that less, in some ways it's very easy sometimes, and I do it myself, so I know I think it's easy, to sort of say, Buenos Aires versus the rest. What I think is much more interesting here is class and neighborhood difference in Buenos Aires and reaction to this in the context that I just raised. One more point about the issue of consumption, and I'm not sure I quite agree with your point, Jeff, on this, but maybe in the end you do. I'm not sure I see it as an anxiety. And this goes to some earlier comments I made, for example, the Timmerman comment. I think Argentines have already gone down the path where they are consuming differently. That drive-in screams something to me that relates, for example, to how Palito Ortega is being consumed in this time period, borrowing from American pop culture. And now sort of the most controversial point of all that I'm going to raise, which is that, I said before that there was not a political party that's representing this, the military is trying, and they're succeeding. In the 60s, and I would argue, in the early part of the process, they are communicating a sophisticated modernity fantasy around consumption. And again, I think there's something to explore there.
For Alex, it didn't strike me, I heard a lot about your project, but it didn't strike me until you showed the pictures of how much the Ciudad Deportiva reminds me of the 1893 World Fair in Chicago. both in situating the construction along a possibly unstable island, of trying to present a fantastical architecture. And I would really enjoy hearing more about the sort of architects who were creating this, how they fit into global movements. I know that architects in Argentina were in pretty close dialogue with the sort of like German modernist architectures, like what's his name, Van der Rohe, and I don't know, this seemed more Disneyland fantastical kind of, and I don't know where the inspiration was coming for that. So it would be great to hear more about how that's fitting into an international movement.
Sarah. I've got one question to Ingrid. So you say that 1980s is when football starts kind of lending itself as a tool to create these regional identities. And so I'm thinking that 1980s is also the time when the displacement, the desplazamiento interno, starts really kicking off, leading to arguably quite a reshuffling of these regional identities, because you're looking at masses of people that go and populate cities such as Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, and they come from very, very diverse areas compared to these cities. Well, Cali perhaps is an example. So how the sudden presence of these individuals, who are often indigenous or Afro-Colombians for that matter, what is the dynamics with this, as you say, the creation of regional identities through football, soccer, and the displacement?
For Alex, I actually didn't want to ask you a question because I know your project so intimately, but I haven't seen you in a year, so I felt I could ask you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, no problem. I think one thing that's really interesting about this project is it's a one-off. I mean, there's no other club that's doing a project of this massive scale. So how much can we really pull from one club and one project, right? On the other hand, there was a habit for many years of clubs getting favors from the government. Even in the same years that Boca was getting these big projects, Independiente got a little water fee waived, and other clubs got a little piece of land they'd have to pay taxes on. So there was this culture going on. So I think in some ways...
Oh
yeah, it goes way back, right? But even in this context, Boca was not alone, except the scale. The scale was the big difference. So in many ways, you have a project that's both singular, but it's also part of a culture. And then if we pull it out even further, we have the Ciudad Infantil during the Peronist period, right? Huh? The Ciudad Infantil. And like a children's city. Right. Then the Ciudad de Opera, right? And then you have, even today, I guess, I don't know to what extent, but the talks about Technopolis and everything the government's doing. And then in the 1930s, the big projects in downtown Buenos Aires. So I think there's some help in trying to contextualize this project as being part of one of many different projects of different scales. The big difference being not so driven by the government, but more from a club association, right? So that was one. I don't know if it's a question or comment, but I think that would be good. The other one is this figure Armando, and I've wrestled this with myself, like many other of the presidents of clubs, was referred often as a caudillo. Mm-hmm. And that applied to players and others. And so you have these club associations with votes and members, and you elect these officials, yet a lot of them stay in power for 20, 30 years, which goes very much contrary. And they seem to rule that club. And their strongest opponents don't come from within the club, but they actually come from rivals with other club presidents, So I think there's something really interesting about club associations of tens of thousands of people being ruled by one person who it's his vision, his ideas, and sets up this little crony system that everybody's trying to please that one person. To explore that contradiction, I think, is really interesting. Because Armando actually, I remember reading an article in which he threatened to resign in 1970. Mm-hmm. And it was a ploy to garner public sympathy. Whereas in River Plate, Liberty actually was overthrown.
Right.
And so, anyway, just, I guess, questions.
Sure.
And I think that, Chris, you're bypassing. Okay, so you guys have your answers, and then we're going to wrap up.
Okay. Yeah, when I saw Luna de Avellaneda, I was like, this is perfect. But it's been, there's a romantic image captured in that film, which is the original tension that I wanted to focus on in my project was clubs as nonprofit civic associations that are there for its members, that have always had the tension of, we're a professional soccer team, we want to win titles, and we make a lot of money off of professional soccer. And so I wanted to trace like the real economic transformations within the club that made that people like Armando had to react to. Like the old formula was get the state to build you a stadium and then put bums in seats and you're good. And in the 1960s, the costs of having a professional soccer team get so high, and stadium attendance does decrease a bit, but they're putting new competitions in format. But they need to go beyond that to look at how they're going to remain solvent. And I think Armando's idea behind the Ciudad Deportivo is that he wanted to grow Boca's socio base from 30,000 members, which is amongst the big five, not actually that big. We had more than double. He wanted to increase it to 250,000 socios and have socios' monthly dues like make the club solvent forever and to pay for this space. And so his idea was like capture a chunk of Buenos Aires, make it into a theme park, and then people will have more Boca fans and we'll be able to keep the club solvent forever. So I think there's stuff about Campanella's films that have like direct parallels in that, like commercialization to save the club, selling the club's soul at the same time, that I'm tapping into in real ways in my project. The borrowing from American pop culture, I can maybe talk to three of your responses at the same time. Both Jeff and Ronnie are echoing the advice of one of the scholars I'm working with in Argentina to compare this to, Dave, what you said, like a real drawing of American pop culture. It's no coincidence that this is the first time that lots and lots of Argentines are going to Disneyland, and they build Italparque, they build Interama. There's theme parks for the first time in Buenos Aires that are massive and geared towards a very popular audience. And so I think this is an opportunity to look at how both, the Ciudad Deportiva is spanning 65 to 74 in its most active stages. So I can look at very different military governments that are making good on this promise. They are trying to make good on this promise in very real ways, everyday felt ways, to make things available, that they are the bringers of progress. Like they are the ones that have brought order to the national economic situation and to the seizing of the control of the city and having a city master plan that they actually follow through on. This is the last city master plan that like Buenos Aires is actually really, really transformed by in a concerted way. The rest are kind of like patch jobs. So yeah, I think that's excellent advice to look at the military that way. And a thread that I'll follow. I think that pretty much covers. Yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention, responding to Ronnie, is that the Armando as all-powerful and a Galicia at the same time as being accountable to allegedly a democratic system of shareholders in the club. That comes good in '72 when they almost throw him out of the club. They're literally 2 votes away from the Asamblea from being able to throw him out. But then since they don't have a majority, the majority is able to cite a club bylaw that says you can't throw out a president in the middle of the term, you have to call for new elections. But he came very, very close to, both of his vice presidents resigned on him and formed the opposition. So I think it's a really neat moment to, I think, tap into, what is the lesson of the area, that there is this Galicia movement amongst club presidents, and they do concentrate power in the executive like never before, both in how they manage the clubs and who they are in Argentine society. They're such powerful members. But there is still a democratic procedure that does nearly succeed in throwing Armando out. But it's certainly one that's different from the teens and 20s.